It's nice to be filled with music this morning, isn't it? That was wonderful. Now we have a special quartet that is going to bless us again with their music, and you'll notice in the bulletin it says JATH Quartet. And just in case you're wondering what that is, that stands for Jordan, Annie, Ted, and Heidi. Jordan and Annie Vargas and Ted and Heidi Rasmussen. Thank you so much for just sharing the melody of heaven with us this morning. Did I say Ted? I'm so sorry. Tim Rasmussen. Thank you.
On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land, where my possessions lie. I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land. When shall I reach that happy place and be forever blessed? When shall I see my Father's face and in His kingdom rest? I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land. Filled with delight, my raptured soul would here no longer stay. Though Jordan's waves around me roll, fearless I'd launch away. I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land.
I want to know who selected that song. Did you know, Annie, that that's just one of my favorite songs in all the world? Thank you. Thank you so much. And Ted, Tim, Don't worry, I'm Jim Rich Sam. Have been for years. That's what happens when you're the third boy. I must admit that it's been with fear and trepidation that I've covered with you things like the 7 last plagues, the final events that are mentioned there in the book of Revelation. But it's been with anticipation that I've come to today's message. I love to study the 20th chapter of the book of Revelation. There are certain chapters in the Bible that stand out. If I say 1 Corinthians 13, just about everybody in here probably can remember what's the topic of 1 Corinthians 13. If I were to say Hebrews 11, many of you likewise would know that's the chapter of faith, as the 1 Corinthians 13 was that of love. Chapter 20 in the book of Revelation deals in detail with a topic that is dealt with basically in no other place in the Scriptures, at least in this kind of detail. It's alluded to. Some of the details are mentioned, and you have to put a lot of things together, but chapter 20 brings it together. Have you ever been traveling on a trip? And you're headed out in the car and you look in the distance and you see these beautiful mountains, and as you approach, you go over the first mountain thinking the next one is pretty close to it. But as you top the pass of that first ridge, what happens sometimes? You see a whole valley stretched out before you, and the next one's a ways away, right? That's the way it is with history and the prophecies of the Bible. And as the prophets way back in the Old Testament looked way in the future, they didn't get into some of the detail that John gets into as we approach the end. I love driving across Highway 50, the loneliest highway in the world. You know, east of Fallon, Nevada. I love going across there. I was there with Joel and Gilbert not long ago in their van headed to Daystar Academy. One of the things I like about Highway 50, you go across this, there's hardly any traffic there, straight as can be, and you're going across the long valley, and you go across this ridge of mountains. What happens? Have you been across that highway? You drop down, and here's another long, long stretch, and another ridge of mountains. You go over them, and another long stretch, another ridge of mountains. And it just goes on and on and on. But you know what? We got to cross Nevada. And Jesus is coming too. And these things that look so far ahead will one day be here. Many of them have already come and transpired. As we looked at the first half of Revelation, after all, what did we notice? That which was written as prophecy by the Apostle John, back in his day, it was prophetic. But as we study it, what is it to us? It's history. And we can compare the prophecy with the fulfilled history. But since chapter 12 in Revelation, we've been dealing with those greater details of the end time. And you remember, as we approached chapter 12, when we looked in chapter 12, we began to understand why back there in that history section, we saw so many wars, so many conflicts, so many problems. We looked in Revelation 12 and we see, after all, war started in heaven. And that war, the instigator of that war and all his helpers were cast out of heaven. And lo and behold, where do we find them today? In our old world. Answers a lot of questions, doesn't it? About why our world is the way it is. So many people blame God for so much evil in this world. The Bible doesn't show God being the author of evil. The Bible shows that evil was invented within the heart of a divine being, well, not a divine being, a heavenly being, I should say. Almost, he wanted to be divine, and that became the problem. Remember Isaiah chapter 14, Ezekiel chapter 28 tells us that story. We've talked about those before. We saw the war in heaven. We saw he was cast out. What did we see was his main activity once he was cast out to this earth? That old dragon called the serpent, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, that red dragon. Remember, he tried to destroy the woman. Actually, he tried to destroy her seed first, didn't he? But he couldn't destroy the seed because the seed was caught up to heaven, remember, Revelation 12 says. So Christ was safe from him. Of course, after he had had his heel bruised, as Genesis 3 foretold, and after he crushed the head of the serpent. He paid a great price for you and me. I believe the Bible shows that he's going to retain humanity. He will have the human form and identify with each of us throughout eternity. And the great reminders of sin will be in the body of Christ. As we left chapter 12, remember we were just leaving at the very end of chapter 12, and we see that since he couldn't get Christ, the dragon is trying to get all the followers of Christ, and finally the ones that are really the object of his wrath. 12:17 are those that are called the remnant of her seed, who keep his commandments and have the faith of Jesus, or the testimony of Jesus. And we studied about that. And you remember that when we got into chapter 13, we began to see the activity of the dragon in the old world and in the new world and around the world, under the symbols of a dragon and a beast and a false prophet, trying to destroy God's people, especially as the time grows shorter and shorter and shorter. Then when we got into chapter 14, we saw that there were a people who would survive it all, who would be successful in following the Lamb, remember, wherever he went. They're called the 144,000. And then we looked at that message that makes them like they are, the three angels' messages. And we saw then the glorious climax of the coming of Jesus at the end of chapter 14. But as Revelation often does, that's not the end, because then it jumps back and starts leading up again to the second coming. We're going to see, even in our chapter today, how the Revelator goes in, tells it to the end, and then comes back and fills in some more detail for us. And we have to watch for that. Otherwise, we misunderstand how things are happening. Those people who follow God's message are not without troubles in this world, and we saw that were it not for the activities of God in the 7 last plagues, they unlikely would be destroyed and eradicated off the face of the earth. But those plagues, like hooks, hold Satan and his people back from destroying all of God's people. And as God begins to unfold who he really is, the plagues take place. Not out of anger, but out of love, to keep his people and to preserve his universe. You remember, we saw the judgment on the great whore in chapter 17. We saw the desolation that brought about in chapter 18. And then we saw the climax, the coming of Jesus, and the symbol of riders on white horses in chapter 19. Now, we're going to look at the things that transpire from the time the riders on the white horse come until the end of sin. That's Revelation 20. Starts with the coming of Jesus. It ends with another coming of Jesus. Did you know there's a third coming? Let's get into Revelation chapter 20 today, and let's talk a little bit about it. Revelation 20, I have the King James with me. I saw and heard an interesting thing or two as you were reading from the NIV in the scripture, and I liked one of the things. I'll mention it here in verse 1. And I saw an angel come down from heaven. So remember the word angel, messenger, minister, ministrant. But this tells us this is a heavenly angel. This is one who is sent from heaven. So there's an angel that comes down from heaven having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. Now, bottomless pit. What's a bottomless pit? What was it in the NIV as Gerald read it with you? Abyss. That's a helpful thing. Now, we could go to the dictionary and we could look that up. And we could find out what it means to be an abyss. But what have we done in times past when we really wanted to know a concept that the Bible's talking about? Do we consult Webster's dictionary to figure out what the Bible is saying? It's a handy little reference to understand our modern language. But if we want to know the true concept behind a biblical term, what do? We go to the Bible. And for many years now, we've been talking about principles of Bible study here. Do you remember one of the key references I like to look at? Some of you who've been here a while, when I'm studying a concept in the Bible. Okay, especially the very first time something is brought up in the Bible. What's the first time that this term, abyss, is brought up in the Bible? Abyssos. What's the first time? Well, you know, the New Testament's written in Greek. I heard it. All right. So the concept, though, predates the New Testament. So how will we get Greek out of the Old Testament? You know what scholars often do when they're studying Old Testament concepts? They often go back and look in a very popular Greek translation of the Old Testament that was very popular back in the times of the New Testament. It's kind of like the King James of their day, all right, for the Old Testament. It was the authoritative translation. We could tell you some of the stories about the stories about how it came about, but we are studying Revelation today. If you go back into the Septuagint version of the Old Testament and you look to see the first time they decide to use that term, guess where it leads us? It leads us a long ways back in the Bible. Takes us all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. Not quite to the first verse, but almost. Almost. Turn with me back to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis 1 verse 1 is where I'll start. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth, ha'eretz, the earth, was without form and void. What is it? Tohu wabohu? Without form and void. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. Tahom is the old Hebrew term. But guess what Septuagint version uses? Abyssos. Well, abusu, because it's the genitive. I want to think about that. What do you think this world was like? Now, where are we in the account of the creation as we look at the darkness was on the face of the deep? What has not happened yet? All of the creative process, basically, except for whatever this formless void mass was that God was going to do something with. He had not yet said, "Let there be light." This was not a hospitable place. There was no life. There was nothing to support life. It was cold and dark and totally absent of anything to support life at that time. I want to submit to you that that term speaks to our present study today. That was the first biblical understanding of the term. And that as he sees an angel come down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit. Now, we'll talk about what happens in that bottomless pit, but I just want you to remember that picture we just talked about. What does he do? He has a great what? What's he going to do with the chain? Well, we better read it. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him with a chain, obviously, for 1,000 years. What kind of chain would you use to bind the devil? What do you think? You know, I have a tow chain sometimes I put in my truck, my little Toyota four-wheel drive, and I go out there on the farm and I hook that on the back of my Toyota and use it kind of like a tractor. And I hook onto an old walnut tree that's fallen down and I drag it over by the burn pile so I can cut off all the limbs and throw them in the burn pile and then cut up the rest of the tree for firewood. That chain is one strong chain. It's stronger than my bumper on my truck. I have to be careful. I have to be careful where I hook that on my. One time I hooked it kind of on the part of the bumper there, and I pulled the log, and I realized that it kind of pulled my bumper up a little bit, you know. And when I opened up the tailgate, it was pretty snug right there. I said, I better be more careful with my truck. That chain is strong. You think that chain's strong enough for the devil? No. What? Turn with me to 2 Peter chapter 2. It's not very far. Remember, 2 Peter is just a little ways before Revelation. The little second letter that the Apostle Peter wrote, chapter 2, verse 4. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into what? Chains of darkness. Isn't that interesting? Especially in the context of Tom Abusos. Now go with me back closer to Revelation, right the page just before Revelation, where we have that little tiny short book that can get lost between the pages, the book of Jude. Only one chapter, so we just refer to verse. Verse 6, in Jude. And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under what? Darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Obviously, the chains that bind the devil have to be chains of circumstance that the Lord himself imposes. And included in that, I believe, is a dark, forbidding place we call this world. Now, I say this world. You know, I need to make a little explanation here, because if you were to go to the dictionary and you look up the word millennium, 1,000 years, I looked it up in my little dictionary in my desk that I keep just to help me if I am not using the computer, using spell check, you know. I looked up millennium. Guess what? I think it was the second or third definition that little dictionary had. The second definition was 1,000 years of peace on this earth. Did you know we're way out of step as Seventh-day Adventists, because we believe the Bible teaches that, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I'll just spill the beans. We believe that during the 1,000 years, God's people are with him in heaven, in peace in heaven. And that during the 1,000 years, this old world is not a place you would want to be, because every island has been moved out of its place, every mountain has been brought low. There has been an earthquake such as never was. this earth is a dark, foreboding place. And I think, from the language we have here in Revelation 20, that I think this angel that comes down from heaven has the power to bring the world back to what it was before God created anything. Before he organized the creation of this world and put it all so beautiful. And I'll tell you why I think that in a little bit. I'll tell you the purpose of that. But let's read on. We have to get back to Revelation 20 now. Revelation 20, verse 3. Now he cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a what? A seal upon him. Do you have any marginal notes in your Bible about that seal? My King James that I'm reading from here has a little marginal note. It refers me back to a particular verse in the Old Testament. Now, I want you to know I didn't write that note, and no Seventh-day Adventist wrote that note. That was whoever edited this particular King James Bible and put in the marginal references. Daniel 6:17. What happened in Daniel 6:17? Some of you remember what Daniel 6 talks about. It's a story that the children know. It's one of their most popular stories. Daniel where? In the lion's den. What does the seal have to do with anything in the lion's den? What happened when Daniel got put into the lion's den? They set a seal upon it. Why? Keep him in there. Make sure no one goes in to help him. Make sure that he really receives his due punishment. Isn't it interesting that the one who was the instigator to make sure that seal was set on Daniel's lion's den now has a seal set upon him for 1,000 years. The seal is set upon him. Why? That he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that, he must be loosed a little season. We'll talk about that later in the chapter. Notice how John kind of makes sure you know what's going to happen so you don't get too nervous. And then he comes back to the present and talks about some more things. So, for the 1,000 years, the devil and his angels are in chains of darkness. What about God's people? Oh, first of all, let me think about why would God take away all of the elements of creation? Why would he do that? When Satan, notice the purpose is that he should deceive the nations no more. When's the first deceptive act of Satan on this world? Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. I want you to think about what Satan used for his temptation. I want you to think about Eve walking up to that forbidden tree. Now, she should have stayed away from it. There's a lesson for us there, isn't there? I would have given that tree a wide berth, I think, I hope. Wouldn't have wanted to be close to that tree. But evidently, she was curious. What do you think she might have been thinking in her mind about that time as she was looking at that tree? What kind of questions would you have in your mind if you were looking at the tree of knowledge of good and evil? What? What would you be thinking? What's the natural response for the human? Why, I wonder why God doesn't want us to eat of this tree. It looks good. It's a beautiful tree. What's the Bible say? She looked at it and it looked good. What did the fruit look like? It looked delicious. What was telling her all that? Her own sensory perceptions were telling her those things. Now, as she's reflecting on that and wondering in her mind, why would God say not to eat? There's a sound. the first sound that Satan makes on this earth that we know of. And in the King James, what's the word? The first word out of his mouth in the King James is, yea. But you know, if you look closely, that's really not, the modern equivalent would be more like, yeah. But it's really not a word. It's a sound. And most likely he did something like, she's reverie-ing about this, you know, she's thinking, contemplating. And out of the tree, from this beautiful winged serpent, comes, huh? Huh? Yeah? He's almost reading her mind. Well, what does he say? Let's read it. Genesis chapter 3, verse 1, if you want to find it quickly. Genesis 3:1. Right at the end of the chapter, of the verse, he says, yea, yeah, hath God said, ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? Just a little question. Just a little question. Harmless question. What's the purpose of his question? The purpose of his question is to destroy her faith. This is to implant a little seed of doubt in her mind that she might begin to question God's wisdom and think that maybe she or someone else might have a little bit more insight and understanding than God himself. That's the purpose of his question. By the way, you who are teachers, be very, very careful that you don't teach with this methodology of asking leading questions that would encourage young students to doubt the thinking and the ways of God. Many people think that that's really intelligent to do so. But they're following the methodology of the dragon. So be very careful about that particular kind of thinking. All right, so we were talking about why Satan is bound here. Satan has been deceiving us from the beginning with things that God has given us for blessing. The senses that Eve had, weren't they given for blessing? Aren't taste buds a good thing? Aren't sensations, feelings a good thing? They were given us by God. They have very important uses. I want you to notice that throughout history, Satan has only been able to tempt us by using the gifts of God and turning them for a wrong use. All he can do is take what God has said and what God has done and, yes, he distorts it, he perverts it. He gives us counterfeits. For every truth that God has given to bless us, Satan has a counterfeit to put in its place. Every one. You think about it. You think about our marriage relationship that God gave us and the family unit and how God designed it in the scriptures. Does Satan have any alternatives in our day? So much so that we talk about alternative lifestyles. You can point to every blessing that God's given us, and you can find that. We don't have time to do that today. It would take us too long. So what I would submit to you is that Satan now is placed in a position where he has none of the gifts that God created. Satan wanted to take the place of God. Satan wanted to be like God. Satan wanted to have his freedom and do what he wanted to do. During this 1,000 years, he will have every opportunity to work his magic. He will be able, if he so chooses, to create a world of his own. After all, it's right there. All he has to do is say, let there be light. He will have every opportunity to create beings after his own image. He'll have every opportunity to fill this world with all kinds of delightful things from his own creative mind. There's only one problem. He's not God. And he doesn't have the power to do those things, nor the wisdom to put them together in the right way. Everything he has done to this time, he's been dependent on gifts that God has given. In fact, if he were to be totally honest, he's dependent on God for his own existence, for his very life force. So I want you to think about that as we talk now about what's happening with God's own people. Verse 4, and I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. Judgment. Judgment given to them? Do you remember in Corinthians? Do you remember the Apostle Paul talking about, know ye not we shall judge what? Angels. Is that some kind of hyperbole? What's he talking about? In this chapter, we see two parts of God's judgment process. We've already been through the first part in the previous part of Revelation. I want you to remember that in every judgment in this earth, there are three parts. In fact, it's just a necessary thing when it comes to judging something or someone. The first part of judgment, what is the first part about? If somebody has been accused of doing wrong, what's the first thing you must determine? Don't you have to determine if the evidence warrants a sentence one way or the other? Don't you have to look at the evidence to see they've been accused? When Jesus comes, do you remember Matthew 25 where Jesus talks about separating the sheep from the goats? How does he know which ones are sheep and which ones are goats? See, prior to his coming, it's been determined. There's been that part of judgment process already. It's very obvious. So now that he has come, we have another judgment in process during the 1,000 years. What's the next part of judgment if the person has had enough evidence against them that they are guilty? Now, if the evidence doesn't warrant a verdict of guilt, then they are declared innocent. It's over. But if they're guilty, it's not over by any means. What's the next part of judgment? Sentencing. What's appropriate to what they did? Is that the final end of judging? One more part after that. What's the third part of judgment? Carrying out the sentence. I would submit to you that during the 1,000 years, the second part of judgment is going on. And that it says, judgment is given unto them who are them. Well, notice he says, and I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus, for the word of God, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands. They lived and reigned with Christ. How long? 1,000 years. Where is this, by the way? Do you remember a little text in John 14, verses 1 to 3, when Jesus was getting ready just before his crucifixion? He was preparing his disciples for his departure. He said, let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are what? Many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you. Where? Unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. The Bible is crystal clear. Crystal clear. All we have to do is read it for ourselves and quit letting other people tell us what it says. It's clear. will live and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Why? I think there's some work to do. What do you think it's going to be like when Uriah the Hittite is raised and meets David? What do you think? Nancy, you think that'd be a real pleasant thing? After all, David only had him killed, and he was one of David's most loyal soldiers. You read that story, read it with your mind open, and you'll almost abhor David when you read the story. Fortunately, the story of Nathan the prophet coming to David happens after that. And David is convicted. But all David did was kill his loyal soldier, whom he'd already defiled his wife, and took his wife for his own. Pretty terrible, terrible instance. But as I read the story of Uriah the Hittite, I think he was a very noble and very good man. I think he understood what it meant to trust God and be loyal to God and to his king. I think it's very possible that he could be in the kingdom. And David, we have the Lord saying, he's a man after my own heart. I think it's very possible David could be there. I think there might have to be a little bit of healing process somewhere along the line. We're going to grow up as calves in the stall, according to the Old Testament. I don't think that just means physically, like I try to tell Steve Lawrence, I'm going to get taller. I say, Steve, be careful, I might be taller than you in the new earth. I'd have to grow a lot, wouldn't I? But that's not the growing I really want. The growing I really want is the growing in here. If I could just flip a switch, and if I could give everything I own to have to flip the switch, I would make that decision in a moment. If I could flip that switch, and my heart would be right with God. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? But evidently, it's the type of thing that takes a growing process. Jesus says, first the plant, the seed, and then the little plant, and then finally you get the fruit, the grain and the ear. That's the way it is. And that's the way he makes us. That's the way he recreates. Remember when he did the creation series and we saw all those parallels in the recreation process, how God so carefully restores his image in us. That's what he's about. He wants to put back the image of God that was lost in us. And so we get to live and reign with him for 1,000 years, and he is there and all the angels of heaven there to help us work out those things that we need to work out and take care of, because at the end of the 1,000 years, we'll see next time, he's going to wipe away every tear from our eyes. But I want you to notice that it doesn't mention the tears being wiped away until the 1,000 years is expired. I think I'm going to have some tears if I'm privileged to be in God's holy city, watching what happens to some of my friends that decided not to be. I don't like to think about that. They lived and reigned. We better read the rest. Verse 5. But the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Now I want you to notice there's a little parenthetical thing here, because he goes to the end and he talks about the rest of the dead not living until the end of the 1,000 years. Obviously the first resurrection had to take place at the beginning of the 1,000 years. You find it very clear if you read 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13 and on, or if you read 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51 and on, very clear. You remember? We do not precede those who are asleep in Jesus. They are raised first, and then we which are alive, together with them are caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And it says, so shall we ever be with the Lord. Wherefore comfort one another with these words, he says. They should give us great comfort. Blessed and holy is he that has part in the first resurrection. On such the second death, what's the second death? That's the one from which there is no resurrection. On such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him for 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are expired, over, done, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison. Now remember what put him in prison. What put Satan in prison was that when God came, he took all his people away. And all the wicked, remember, we've talked about this before, at the second coming of Jesus, they're destroyed at the brightness of his coming. They call for the rocks and the mountains to fall on them and hide them from his face. It's too glorious. And they're destroyed with that bright, glorious appearing. Then every mountain is brought down, every island moved out of its place. There's a great convulsion on this earth, and this earth is brought to a devastating situation. And Satan is bound by chains of circumstances here. What would loose him would be the opposite. What would loose him from prison would be the life giver coming again, and people to work with again. What did it say? The rest of the dead live not again until, so they're going to live again, the wicked, until the 1,000 years is expired, according to the Bible. Jesus talked about it. There in Matthew, Jesus talked about two resurrections. The resurrection of the righteous and the resurrection to damnation, he called it, if we put it in the King James. The resurrection of the wicked, in other words. You remember that he told Caiaphas he would see the Son of Man coming, remember? Now, well, that's another topic. All right. So, he shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog, or Gag, or the leader, which it means, and his family, Magog, Satan and all his followers. We talked about that earlier. We don't have time to go into all that today. To gather them together to battle, the number of them is as the sand of the sea. I want you to notice then that here you have all the wicked of all the ages alive, according to this. Now the next verse shows us that in proximity to them are all the righteous of all the ages alive. So what we have at this point is all the people who ever lived on the earth, according to Revelation, will be alive at one time. Verse 9, and they went up on the breadth of the earth, and this is talking about the wicked, and compassed the camp of the saints about the beloved city. What's the name of that beloved city? New Jerusalem, that's right. I love to hear that song, The Holy City. Remember Kelly Maurer playing it up here on her piano so wonderfully? The Holy City. Satan and all those influenced by him now, because he now goes out to deceive. See, he started deception back there with that, and he's been deceiving ever since. And when he comes from his prison house of darkness and frigidity, and he has people again to work with, and in the very presence and glory of God, with the holy city there, with full view of God's glory and majesty, he goes out to deceive once again. His character is unchanged. And what the millennium does, it shows that what Satan is will never change. What his followers are, they have determined in their minds, and they will never change. For when he suggests it, they all, with one accord, surround the city of God to destroy it and attack it. Can you imagine wanting to take God's own city? Wouldn't you think, after learning all this stuff, how wrong you really were? Wouldn't you think it would be time to just say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I don't deserve any mercy. With that kind of attitude, you would have true repentance. But that's not the attitude of Satan and his followers. And so it says, fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them in order to save God's city, God's people, ultimately God's universe. This is one of the most important events in the history of the entire universe. The ultimate disposition of evil and sin. And this whole process showing how irrational it's been and how wrong it is to go any other way but the ways of God. And the devil, verse 10, now we jump back. They've been devoured. Well, we're still in the devouring stage. We'll jump back in verse 11. The devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. Now, we talked about that earlier, so I'm not going to deal with that today. But if you want to talk about it personally, I'll be glad to. Verse 11, he jumps back now and helps us understand what else is transpiring at this time, right before the final surrounding of the city and the attack on the city. Just as they're ready to surround the city, I believe that's when this happens. As they're all there ready to take the city, he says, here it is. And I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. So the other books prior to the book of life had to be the books of record, right? And the dead which were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. It says, the sea gave up the dead which were in it, death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every man according to his works. How many? Every person, everyone. Even those that were lost at sea. Notice? No one excluded. That's quite a moment, isn't it? I wanted to read to you something, and my time is way spent, so I got to quit. But let me commend to you a book called Great Controversy. Go home today and look it up in page 6. This is a hard number to remember. 666. Paragraph 2. As soon as the books of record are opened and the eye of Jesus looks upon the wicked, they are conscious of every sin which they have ever committed. They see just where their feet diverge from the path of purity and holiness. Just how far pride and rebellion have carried them in the violation of the law of God. You go on and read that whole thing. Oh, it's a moving passage. Page 666, 667, 668, those at least. Let me just read the last short paragraph of that section. The whole wicked world stand arraigned at the bar of God on the charge of high treason against the government of heaven. They have none to plead their cause. They are without excuse, and the sentence of eternal death is pronounced against them. This is not with glee. This is with the same one that says, oh, why will ye die, O house of Israel? Oh, this is not something God is looking for. But it says in verse 14, and death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. The Bible talks about it. All the other things that Revelation foretold have transpired. It's going to happen. What makes the difference? Is your name written there on the page white and fair. In the book, in that book, is your name written there? How do we get it there? We've talked about that many, many times. Many, many times. It's simply our choice. Today we can choose As Daniel says, we can choose to shine as the stars forever and ever, or we can choose to be with that group who will be destroyed by the very presence and the glory of God. You know, Isaiah talks about a people. He says, who will dwell with everlasting burnings? You go back and read Isaiah 38, beginning at verse 14, Isaiah 33, beginning at verse 14, and you'll find out what kind of people can dwell in the presence of everlasting burnings. That's talking about God's own people. We can be in His presence, and it'll be a delightful thing. But the wicked in His presence, it's a very destructive thing. I'm sorry if it's been a little heavy, but just remember, we have every privilege of being in the city that we're going to talk about next time, 2 weeks from today. We're going to talk about that beautiful city, the holy city coming down from, I can hardly wait. Oh, it's a delightful, delightful story.